Welcome to Global Justice Reports, a new online production of the Center for Global Justice. I'm Cliff Durand. I will be your host for today. And I will be telling you something about upcoming events. We're new to these webinars since June 1. We've been doing weekly webinars. And I'll give you some highlights of upcoming ones. We have events scheduled up into January already with some really outstanding speakers. The Center for Global Justice is a multinational and bilingual research center located in San Miguel de Allende, Mexico. The center is devoted to research and learning for a better world. Since 2004, we have offered educational programs in English for expats and visitors, and programs in Spanish for the larger Mexican community.
Did you get my glass out
We've
of the
also
bed?
organized educational travel to Chiapas and to Cuba. Our vision is to move control of economic life and relations with Mother Earth from the 1% to the 99%. Coronavirus has set in relief the failures of neoliberal capitalism. Our weekly Global Justice Report will explore various grassroots democratic solutions, including self-management, cooperatives, mutual aid, public banking, and much more. We have webinars coming up on racism, on universal single-payer healthcare, on the elections, and much more. We welcome suggestions for future programs, and I'm going to show you a screen with an email address to which you can send your suggestions. Also, if you have questions or comments during today's discussion, send it to this email address, global.justice.cliff@gmail.com, and I will relay your questions to the speakers. Some of you are watching this on YouTube. You will need to use that email address, but also those of you who are watching on Zoom should use it as well. Well, it's a pleasure to introduce our discussion leader for today, Bill Fletcher, well-known activist, labor activist, political activist, involved in many issues. And he will be introducing the speakers and moderating the discussion. Let me remind everyone here that you should mute your mic so that other background noise doesn't end up getting broadcast to everyone. So, Bill Fletcher, I'll let you take it away from here.
Thank you, Cliff, and thank you, everyone. And by the way, Cliff, Sangeeta needs to be readmitted. She had to drop off for some reason. Oh, there she is. Okay, good.
Yes, just readmitted her.
Yeah, okay, good. So I want to thank everyone for this, and I want to thank Cliff for inviting me to be your host this afternoon. And I want to ask everyone, please make sure to mute your phones or your computers.
You know what? We're all vertical. That's a good thing.
Okay, because I don't want to start calling out names. Cliff, I think I might need you to mute everybody except for me, because there's some people that don't seem to be listening. Okay. Okay, so it doesn't, it's not revealing anything amazing to say that there really is a specter haunting the world. And that specter is one of right-wing populism. And whether it was the neo-fascist organizing in the Midwest of the United States in the 1980s, or in Europe in the immediate aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet bloc, whether it was the morphing of the Lega Norga in Italy, or in fact the rise of Al-Qaeda in the Muslim world. We see this phenomena of right-wing populism taking religious and secular forms, sometimes evolving into outright fascism, frequently armed, at a minimum, very intimidating. In the largest alleged democracy on the planet, India, we've watched or witnessed the rise of a Hindu nationalist, fascistic at least, regime in a nuclear-armed country within seconds, if not minutes, of another nuclear-armed, less than democratic state, Pakistan. This phenomenon of right-wing populism, neo-fascism, and authoritarianism is today's discussion. And it really will be a discussion. We have excellent panelists. And so we're not going to be giving speeches. My job is to make sure that no one gives a speech except for me. But we're going to have a discussion. And I'm really looking forward to this. We were talking about it before we started. And one of the objectives here is to break from the notion that every form of capitalist rule that we on the left don't like is fascist. We have this tendency on the left to describe anything that we don't like that is capitalist and is repressive as fascist. We want to unpack that. We want to look at what exactly are we witnessing, and what are the strategic implications of an analysis that distinguishes various forms of capitalist rule, and particularly what was known as the exceptional state. In order to move this discussion, I'm honored to introduce our panel. So we have Sangeeta Kamat, who's a professor of comparative education at the University of Massachusetts Amherst and the author of Development Hegemony, NGOs and the State in India. She's an interdisciplinary scholar and has published critical essays on the politics of aid and development, neoliberalism and educational inequality, and Hindu nationalism in India and the diaspora. She's a member of the India Civil Watch International. We also have joining us Walter Baier, an economist in Vienna who was the national chairman of the Communist Party of Austria, the KPO, from 1994 to 2006. He was an editor of the Austrian weekly Volksstimme, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, and from 2007 until 2020 has been the political coordinator of the network Transform Europe. And finally, we have Tarso Luis Ramos, executive director of the Political Research Associates, a 40-year-old research and strategy center dedicated to building authentic, multiracial feminist democracy and averting authoritarianism. PRA is a leading progressive source of analysis on US and global right-wing movements, and Ramos is a sought-after public speaker whose work has been featured in The Guardian, New York Times, and Time Magazine, among other outlets. So I want to begin by just welcoming the panelists and thank you for joining us today. Anyone that's just joining us, again, please put your computers on mute. And what we're going to be doing is we're going to be conducting this discussion for maybe about 45 minutes or so. We're going to see how it goes. And then we're going to open it up to questions and comments. We can't guarantee that every question and comment we'll be able to address, but we will do our best. So let me just start with a sort of a general question. Right-wing populism has been defined in a tremendous book by Chip Berlay and Matthew Lyons called Right-Wing Populism in America. They define it as in effect, a movement that is in response to and trying to beat back progressive change. I would add to that that right-wing populism globally is racist, xenophobic, it is misogynist, it is authoritarian in both its objectives and structure. And it additionally looks for the future in the past. Every right-wing populist movement I've ever come across has a critical image, a critical mythical image around which it organizes itself, whether it is the alleged caliphate that Al-Qaeda and Daesh worship, or whether it's the 1950s in the Confederate States of America, both of which are worshiped by right-wing populists in the United States. And in both cases, the direction for the future is seen as somehow an extension of the past. If that is correct, and you as a panelist may not agree, and you're free to disagree, what would you explain, what would you say explains the expansive growth of right-wing populism as a global phenomenon since 1990? So whoever would like to kick that off, please run with it. Or do I need to call on you guys? All right, so I'm going to call on Tarso.
Thank you, Bill, and thank you for organizing this great panel. I'm looking forward to the discussion. I largely agree with that characterization of right-wing populism and right-wing populist movements. I think I would add a couple of additional characteristics. I do think that in general terms, right-wing populist movements tend to go after elites, existing elites, although the movements ultimately are more interested in replacing one set of elites with another set of elites, their elites with our elites. And they also tend to target classes that they consider to be parasitic at the bottom, usually defined in ethnic, racial, religious, similar kinds of terms. And so there's this notion that the people, the real people, right, are being squeezed between parasites at the top and parasites at the bottom. And the response is to organize to get the right sort of elites in power. And so it's anti-elite, but it's not radical in the sense of getting to the root problem of inequality and so forth. I might contest you a little bit on the notion that all right-wing populist movements are captured by nostalgia. In this, I think no more so than I think most left popular movements are captured by nostalgia. And I might even argue that increasingly, at least at a leadership level, the most effective movements on the right are actually much more forward-looking. They imagine a different future, more horrifying in many cases than a romanticized past, if I might offer that. With respect to what's given rise to right-wing populism globally, given the limits on time, this will be a little glib, but I think that a few things for sure, right? One is the collapse of the Soviet bloc, the kind of bipolar geopolitical arrangement that we had up until that point, the rise of neoliberal economic arrangements and the incredible economic inequalities that those have driven. And parallel to that, the rise of mass-based religious movements, on the one hand, often giving a mass voting base, among other things, an organizing base for regressive politics, often in alliance with neoliberal elites, strangely enough, on the one hand, and then the rise of racial and ethnic nationalist movements. So if I were to say what the key drivers are of right-wing populism globally, it's been this collapse of the previous geopolitical set of arrangements, the rise of neoliberalism, and moving into some power vacuums, mass movements that are either theocratic or racial and ethnic nationalist, or in some cases, a marriage of those two, which I think we see, for instance, at least to some degree on the Indian subcontinent and some other places.
Thank you, that's great. Sangeeta, do you want to add anything, or Walter, either one of you, to what Tarso just laid out?
Well, Europe in a certain way offers a privileged position on discussing the issue from a theoretical point of view, because Europe is not a state and it's not a union. It consists of 55 states, nations, whatever you may call that, and even the European Union consists of 27 states. And that means that what we see when talking about the far right are, so to say, 50 shades of brown. And from that point of view, I'm skeptical whether it is very useful to coin one particular notion to describe the phenomenon. Otherwise said, and I know that it is always difficult to transfer, so to say, the linguistical experience from one region to another region, but I'm very, very reluctant in employing the notion of left-wing populism, because that, in Europe at least, immediately raises the question of left-wing populism. I believe that the argument from Laclau and Chantal Mouffe saying, well, populism, that is a style of politics and that can be employed either by the right or by the left, is profoundly wrong, because that, what we call in a sloppy way right-wing populism, usually is a rivalry among the capitalist elites on how to govern a country in a political and economical crisis, while that what is referred to as left-wing populism or a socialist transformative strategy aims at changing the class content of society, and that is qualitative the contrary. And analytically, I would say from a European point of view, I mean, we have parties like the Fidesz in Hungary or the PiS in Poland, which reflect the transition crisis from the Soviet system to a very brutal neoliberal system. Then we have mass parties like in France or in Italy, La Lega, Rassemblement National in France, which reflect the disenchantment of large layers of the working class with social democracy. And then we have cases in which these parties primarily express a sort of social chauvinism, meaning we don't want to share neither with refugees coming to our shores, nor with the poor nations in the south of Europe. And that's why we have to close the borders. And the now governing elites, they don't do that. That's why we challenge this. And that's why we want to change the government. But that, and that is my last sentence for this very first statement, but that makes the difference between them and other bourgeois parties, that they actually and effectively want to change the way of governing and the character of the state. That is the difference. And I believe that that is not sufficiently described through the notion of populism. That has to do with reaction, capitalist reaction against progress, may it be reformist or revolutionary.
Sangeeta, you want to add anything? You're on mute.
Yeah, I'm not quick enough with the unmute button, but thank you so much for hosting and organizing this conversation, both to the Global Justice Center and to you, to Bill. I would very much agree with Walter on what he said, about saying right-wing populism immediately sort of implies there is something called left-wing populism, and sort of, having these, so any kind of left progressive movement can be easily sort of reduced to that kind of left-wing populism. In terms of sort of what, definitely there's been, a global rise of right-wing populism all around the world, authoritarian populism. And I would say a certain kind of, really proto-fascism, a neo-fascist sort of direction that all of these, what we are calling authoritarian populism is definitely rapidly, I think, moving towards and consolidating. And in agreement with, Tarso and Walter here, that it is what we, I'd call sort of the crisis of crisis management of capitalism, right? So there's a crisis of capitalism, but there's a crisis of managing capitalism, and this kind of neo-fascism, authoritarian populism becomes a response. Authoritarian populism, I would sort of nest as sort of an element within a fascist regime, or as part of sort of of advancing fascism. Maybe authoritarian populism I would see as sort of one of the first or elementary kind of steps that takes place in a sort of advancing path to fascism, or what we'd call sort of maybe proto-fascism or neo-fascism today. So definitely, I think it's the crisis of capitalism, it's deregulation, privatization, and neoliberalism. Certainly, it's also, I believe, a certain kind of drive to imperialism among, where it's not sort of one core country that is sort of seen as the, center of empire, but there are now competing imperial centers and wanting to negotiate or ally with, the imperial power. And so, so there's a drive to imperialism. So a certain kind of strong state that is acting externally and not simply internally. And I think that's also a part of sort of, what sort of drives authoritarian populism, or what I would prefer to call sort of really proto-fascism. But it's also then the escalation towards, in this management of the crisis of capitalism, escalation towards monopoly capitalism and kleptocracy, I think, is another very significant element of this. And again, I agree with Tarso when he says, an authoritarian populism, this kind of the myth of the nation, the constructed nature of nationalism, this kind of national past, the glorious national past, is not necessarily part of authoritarian populism, but definitely is, I think, an essential feature of fascism. And so one is seeing more and more of that. For instance, definitely, that's why I would characterize something like India as very much in that realm, and something that Trump is attempting to do, but is not as, I think, effectively organized that discourse as in India.
So I guess the question I'd have for the three of you then, particularly in light of the difference of opinion that appears to exist between me and Walter and Sangeeta, is then how do you describe this phenomenon? I mean, do you just say right-wing authoritarianism? I mean, there's something very different about what we've seen. These are not traditional conservative movements. There's something very different. And even though obviously there's national specificities, what we see in Poland is not the same thing that we see in Italy. There is a hell of a lot that's shared in common. So how do you describe it? I mean, what is it that we're looking at?
Yeah, this is something I've been really trying to also grapple with. For instance, to have sort of, for instance, Turkey or Egypt as part of this conversation, right? And how is it different from what's happening in Brazil and Bolsonaro versus Modi and Trump? And I think drawing out those distinctions is really an important part of this project, and something that one needs to really do in a very serious, methodical way. But it's not that I have sort of, the answers to it right now, but I do think that there are distinctions to be drawn between, what is happening in Turkey and Egypt versus what is happening in parts of Europe versus Brazil and India and the US. But in a sense, perhaps also trajectories that might very well converge in a way, as part of sort of, yes, building a new kind of fascist international. One does see these kinds of alliances taking place in the ways in which, for instance, surveillance technologies are being, adopted across, by these governments, which might be very similar and very identical almost. And maybe, it could be one sees sort of a Israel sort of definitely being a very big part of those kinds of, adopting the same military and surveillance technologies of these countries. For instance, it's happening in India, and I'm aware it's happening in other countries as well. So I think there is, there are differences and distinctions of where they are on this path, but I think definitely one can also see that there are significant convergences that seem to be in the offing, that are potentially there.
Walter, in your first comments, you tie these movements, or particularly, what I'm describing as right-wing populists, you're saying that this is mainly a question of bourgeois rule. And I want to push back on that, because these seem to be very much mass movements when they're out of power, sometimes having the support of elements of the ruling class and sometimes not. And I think it's important to distinguish in power versus out of power. Just like in the 1920s and 30s, there was the fascism in power, out of power, and in power. And there were certain alignments that took place once fascism rose to state power. And so what I'm hearing from you, and I may not be understanding you correctly, that's why I want to come back to you. It sounds like you're identifying these movements as the machinations of the bourgeoisie. And it seems to me that it's more complicated than that. Am I misunderstanding you?
No, maybe I did not express myself sufficiently clearly. But the point that you make is a very good one, because I usually warn in discussions my colleagues and my comrades to an inflationary use of the term fascism, because it is not politically wise to call 20% or 30% of the electorate in a particular country as fascists. That is childish. But from an analytical point of view, a big mistake of many people is that when they talk on fascism, they talk with the knowledge of the retrospective, meaning they talk on Shoah and on the Second World War. But what actually the theory of fascism was originally was observing the development in the 20s and in the 30s of mass movements who were not in power. And in my research, I can prove in detail actually that many things which the theorists of the 20s and the 30s, Otto Bauer, Karl Polanyi, even Leo Trotsky describe as the rise of fascism, it resembles very much to that what today political scientists describe as right-wing populism. I would say in Europe, the point is that Europe experiences a deep, deep crisis of identity, having been the center of the world with all these colonial empires, and after the decline of the colonial empires, the financial empires, all this economic, political power, this vanishes, and that creates identity problems within the populations, and this creates identity problems within the ruling classes. And I would say that what we see in Europe now is a rivalry between, roughly speaking, two concepts of defining the new place of Europe in the world and of defining the way of governing the societies. One is the authoritarian way, the way of control, of closing borders, of national competition, even of warmongering. And the other way is somehow keeping the balance between the labor movement, the trade unions, the liberal middle classes in a sort of integrative way of ruling. And the one concept now is put forward by an aggressive far right, and it differs from country to country, the extent to which this is adopted by decisive parts of the ruling classes. And this differs also in times. After 2007, 2008, when the economic financial crisis was very intensive also in European societies, you had a tremendous rise of far-right parties. From 2015, 2016 on, you had a decline of these parties, split of these parties, crisis of these parties. So that means this is a process. It's not a conspiracy of the ruling class. It is a competition of political forces to get the support of the ruling classes and to be assigned to shape the new way of governing. And I believe the big advantage of the notion of fascism in an analytical, not in a political way, is that it makes clear that there is a intensive and organic connection between the interests of some parts of the ruling classes and the capacity of certain movements to create hegemony for their interests.
So Tarso, where does the working class fit in all of this? You know, there's, in the United States, there's, in mainstream media, there's constant reference to white workers as being Trump's base. And there's been a lot of dispute about that. In the history of right-wing movements, there have been various appeals to the working class. I mean, the name of the Nazi party, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, and the fact that their colors were red and black, I mean, indicated some interest in something with regard to the working class. Where does the working class fit in this whole schema?
So that's a great question. And I'm going to get to it by way of riffing on a little bit of what I heard from Sangeeta and Walter here. Because I do think that it is useful to understand that right-wing populist movements do not necessarily produce authoritarian conditions. It depends a bit on the strength and the response of the state and of ruling elites. And so part of what's happened here is that neoliberalism has created conditions by which the state is not capable of, and in some cases not interested in, resisting the authoritarian capacities of right-wing populist movements. And so this is not just a question of ideal types. We have to historicize what's happening in this particular moment as we get these movements. And I am sympathetic to the problem of a certain kind of liberal discourse wanting to not deal with the ideological content of these movements by referring to them as populist. And so I do think that's a problem. But I also don't want to let the questions of tactics and strategic communications interfere with our base analysis either. I think there's some legitimacy to talking about right-wing populism, and then understanding that one of the ways that elites get out of dealing with the crisis of legitimacy of failing liberal democracies is by making it all to be a problem of mob rule, right? This kind of a discourse, which I agree doesn't help us and is dangerous. And I've noticed that this is more prominent in Europe actually than in the United States, is an escape valve from dealing with the rise of the right. And so that's a real problem that we need to solve. With respect to your questions about class in all of this, Bill, I would say that, first of all, if we look at the base, the kind of sociological base of support for far-right politics, let's say the phenomenon of Trump in the United States or fascist movements in other places, you often get it from the upper middle class, right? Whether it's the burger class or whether, if you look at who the early Trump supporters were in the United States, they tended to be white men who were making at least $70,000 a year, $70,000 to $90,000 a year, not poor people, not struggling. This is not the precariat, but a strata that does feel precarity and feels its relative status in jeopardy, right? Relative status, not absolute status, in jeopardy. And often that is a core basis of support for far-right, fascistic, let's say, movements. And I'm saying fascistic. I don't think that all authoritarian movements are inherently or ultimately or inevitably fascistic. And I want to return to that theme at some point in this conversation about what distinguishes fascism from authoritarianism, from other sorts of things, because these distinctions are quite important, it seems to me. But back to the class politic piece, I would say that most of what I would call the main drivers towards authoritarianism globally are movements that have a mass character. And so they certainly overlap with the working class, which is in most places, certainly in the United States, a multiracial phenomenon. To speak of the white working class is in fact to speak of mythologies, right, of history and of contemporary politics in the United States. But they have mass characters. So whether this is the mass base organized through right-wing Christian evangelical mobilizations, or whether it's a mobilizations by groups that 6 months ago we were still calling the alt-right, and we might now more generally refer to as kind of either the MAGA crowd or as proto-fascists in the United States, they have a multi-class character, but certainly one that digs into the working class. And they all do, they are all nationalist in the sense that they create a narrative of who the we is, who the true people are, that is by definition exclusionary, sometimes violently so. And this appeal to a mass notion is sometimes coupled with a specific class politic. It is in the case of most proto-fascist movements or right-wing populist movements that make an argument, for instance, that liberal democracy has failed the white working class, the Christian, population, and so forth. So there's a blending of a mass class notion with usually a racialized or a religious definition of who the real people are. That is also a vehicle. We draw on the classic work on mid-century fascism of Adorno and others, deeply masculinized. It's also very deeply about specific gender categories and traditions, and invokes a kind of militarized masculinity is the model from the family to the leader of the state. And so all of these things are part and parcel of what the imagined people is. So it's the class dimension in terms of an actual economic strata is only one element of this. And I think this has always been the case. There's been a tendency for Marxists and neo-Marxists to want to focus in on the class character here and not contend as much with the gender, religious, and other dimensions of this, which are easily as animating, right, in this period, certainly, and I would argue in previous periods as well.
Well, I want to follow up on this, but I do want to return to this question of the distinction between fascism and some of these other forms of right-wing movements. But I want to ask Sangeeta this question following from what Tarso was speaking about. When you're looking at the situation in India and your studies of India, what is the social base of the JVP? Where does class fit in on that? I think that, well, yeah, I'll just leave it at that. Where does class fit in with the JVP? And you're on mute.
It is the BJP's class character is really the middle class is.
Excuse me, BJP. I'm sorry.
The BJP's class character is very much middle class. Has been the one that sort of really galvanized to vote for the BJP and bring them into power in 2014 and once again in 2019. And so this idea that somehow it's sort of the working class is sort of the default base of these kinds of right-wing authoritarian movements, I think is not quite true. And the working class and the precariat, I think, are very much the foot soldiers in the mobilization, for instance, in terms of like when you think about the stormtroopers or the sort of militias that get organized, it is definitely, one would think, yes, a good part of that is the unemployed youth, that are sort of in precarious positions, who are sort of given this sort of new role and sense of responsibility of sort of building the nation anew, that they get sort of mobilized into. But that's really sort of the foot soldiers. And I think the base is also the elite, the sort of domestic corporate class, capitalist class, and the middle classes, sort of, which have typically, in some ways, one would say they've benefited from sort of the welfare developmentalist model of the past several decades, but now feel sort of hampered or in this kind of competitive neoliberal environment, are feeling like, they cannot really succeed or achieve sort of, to their fullest aspirations, and are very happy to back the BJP as sort of saying we need this kind of strong, decisive, and deregulatory kind of, government and state. So, if you think about, in the elections of, the BJP, for instance, it was the first time that actually the corporate class came out in open, explicit support, because otherwise in India, we typically don't have this situation of, the corporate class endorsing a political party like we have here, right? Or companies, etc., or certain sectors of, the corporate class. But there they actually, in that instance, in the, this recent elections, they actually came out and endorsed the BJP, right? So there's been a real sort of mutually reciprocal sort of relationship between the strong states that the BJP promises and what the corporate, domestic corporate class is seeking. At the same time, this is what another author, for instance, Federico Finkelstein, who's a professor at New School, who's written a good bit on actually right-wing populism versus fascism and what are the distinctions. He talks about sort of right-wing populism as politics in a democratic key, right? So that there's a certain way in which there's a certain kind of democratic sort of, trappings of democracy are maintained in authoritarian populism. And you're doing things sort of by the law or by the book in a sense, or following the law. And, but what one is seeing now with the BJP is that they're, in a sense, escaping those trappings of democracy and doing things sort of, that are really, violating the law themselves, or actually taking over the Supreme Court and the police and the army, and infiltrating all of the sort of organs of sort of liberal democracy, right? The institutions of liberal democracy are very much sort of in their play. And here now you see slight bit of discomfort from the corporate class coming forward, but in very polite tones, sort of saying, we have to be careful. We might be sort of, scaring away the, financial sort of, investor class, the global capitalist class. The Modi needs to be a little bit careful, sort of, managing the internal sort of, dissent and, conflicts, etc. And so, but really, otherwise, I think they'd be more comfortable with authoritarian populism, the corporate class. But if it's the turn towards fascism for them might be a bit too extreme, and there might be some contradictions that emerge there.
Thank you. And my apologies, I was using the wrong initials for the Hindu Nationalist Party. I was thinking about another party. But I want to use what you were just saying to go to you, Walter. What is the distinction between this broad, whether one wants to call it authoritarian populist or right-wing populist mass, and 21st century fascism? How would you make the distinction? And in fact, I'd like all of you to comment on it, but I'm just going to pick on Walter first.
Yeah. Excuse me, I want to say a word about working class and
Sure.
parties, because particularly in France, this is a big issue. I would say even an issue of an ideological struggle. And if you look at the things from a very general point of view, you would say that the rise of the Front National, now Rassemblement National, and the decline of the Communist Party took place simultaneously. But that's too abstract. Empirically, even the notion of working class is not really workable, because you have to distinguish between gender, regional, educational, duration of contracts, the branch in which these people work. And we have done empirical research on this with pretty remarkable outcomes. First, this is also general. It turns out that this, so to say, simultaneous decline and rise expresses the fact that a considerable part of the traditional electorate of the Socialist Party and of the Communist Party don't bother anymore to go for elections because they are so disappointed from previous experience with left-wing governments in France. But when it then comes to a more fine-tuned analysis, firstly, you see that there is a very distinct split between parts of the working class who are prone to vote for a far-right party and parts of the working class who are prone to vote for the left. We had a survey at the last presidential elections where Jean-Luc Mélenchon and Marine Le Pen competed to each other. Complete distinct electorates, even ideologically, while the one who vote for Le Pen vote because they think security, migration are the most important issues to them. You have the voters for Jean-Luc Mélenchon. For them are healthcare, employment, social security the main topics. Secondly, there are three markers which distinguish the two electorates. Education. The higher educated the layer of the working class is you look at, the more they are prone to vote for the left. Second, the duration of a work contract. The less long the work contract lasts, the more people are prone to vote for the far right. And the third marker, which is interesting, concerns the exposition of the branch or the region in which they live or work to the international market. The more they are exposed to the international markets, the more they are prone to vote for the far right, the more their branch is connected with public services, they are prone to vote for the left. So empirically, it's not true that the working class has taken the decision to go to the right. That is an instrument of an ideological struggle. And now one sentence, because I don't want to be too long, on the question you asked, what's the distinction? I would say the distinction between a fascist movement and a racist authoritarian movement, might the two of them be in power or not, is their relation to the state. I would say that the characteristic of fascism is the qualitative change of the state. And that can happen revolutionary, as it happened in the 30s in Germany. That can happen gradually. And many people in Poland, in particular in Hungary, are afraid that that is underway by making impossible an opposition to articulate itself, which does not go without contradictions, as you see from the last municipal elections, where in Budapest, the liberal Democrats won the elections. But that what the Orban government systematically tries to do is to dry out the universities if they are not mainstreamed, to get cultural hegemony, closing down theaters, research institutions which are not supportive to the government, buying out mass media, controlling the electronic public media. That is aimed at controlling the state. That doesn't necessarily mean that they will be successful because they have to deal with the European Union. It's not that easy, but that's what exists and what we must be aware of, that there is a fascist possibility which might become material under the condition that the economic and social crisis even is biting more than it does nowadays.
Thank you. Before I call on Tarso, just to you, the viewers, we're going to go a little bit longer than the 45 minutes in the discussion with the panelists. And so should open up for questions in about 10 minutes. But I wanted to make sure to cover this piece, but also I want to ask the panelists, so then what does the left do? And I want to make sure to ask that before we open up to questions. So Tarso and Sangeeta, on this question of the distinction between fascism and other forms of right-wing authoritarianism. Tarso?
So, I sometimes rely on the work of Spanish political philosopher Juan Linz when thinking about authoritarianism. If we think about the actual democracy, authentic democracy, is on one level sort of unlimited pluralism. And we think of totalitarianism is, the annihilation of any opposition. And fascism and its state expression is a form of totalitarianism, right? Authoritarianism is limited pluralism, right? There are institutions that are not created by the state that are allowed to exist, but the parameters of allowable dissent and contest are set by the central authority of power, whether it's an individual or party, whatever the arrangement might be. And so there may still be some contestation, labor unions, churches, other kinds of things. We certainly had labor unions under Brazil's military dictatorship and others. So there was an opportunity for some level of contestation. But actual transition of power did not happen as a result of any kind of democratic process. And everyone had a pretty good idea of the limits of dissent that were allowable before you would be disappeared or put in jail or forced into exile or whatever the case might be. And so if we accept this notion that authoritarianism is the most common way that liberal democracies fail, in that we are in the third great wave of authoritarianism globally, right? The first gave us mid-century fascist movements. The second gave us post-war military dictatorships, often propped up by the Soviet Union or the United States and so forth, the kind that drove my family, right, out of Brazil. And now we're in a third great wave, that this is actually a tendency of liberal democracies to collapse into authoritarianism. Fascism, not necessarily. And I would say that in its state expression, it's a form of totalitarianism that reflects its social movement character, which tends to be a revolutionary, right, form that is anti-state, anti-elite, insists on the notion of a cross-class, masculine, violent rebirth that draws upon this notion of a historic greatness that will rise again in new expression in some of the ways that Sangeeta and Walter and yourself, Bill, were speaking about earlier on, and that these are some of the elements. We could do a whole session on fascism, but not all authoritarianism descends into fascism, just as not all right-wing populist movements are capable of realizing their authoritarian instincts and desires at the level of governance. What I would say is we are in a situation now globally where the three key drivers, I would say, of authoritarianism, right? Racial and ethnic nationalism and theocratic movements, these two by definition want more authoritarian arrangements of power. They require that of the state. We have a situation now, though, where capitalism, where neoliberalism also increasingly requires authoritarian relations in order to maintain these levels of economic inequality. And where neoliberal elites and other capitalist elites have entered into arrangements of shared power with theocratic movements and racial nationalist movements, even where that's not what their traditional or a party orientation might be. And in many cases are at a place where two things are happening simultaneously. One is the social movements are wagging the dog, right? Because they have built independent power. They have chosen, for instance, specific capitalist parties as their vehicle of electoral expression in some cases. Other cases, more in Europe, they've created their own parties and so forth, or sometimes a combination of those things. And the other thing that's happened is that a growing sector of the capitalist class just decides that it's pro-authoritarian. Now, its version of authoritarianism may not be racial or ethnic nationalism or a theocracy, but in fact, this tendency to think, well, the only way to hold on to what we have now is more of a police state is on the rise, and actually even has a base among, in the United States and Silicon Valley, in folks who are making their fortunes under this context of neoliberalism, are pro, in a sense, authoritarianism, even though they have a weird kind of meritocratic notion of who the authoritarians are. Meritocratic, right? Notion of who the authoritarians should be. And so in a way, we have an overdetermined, right, drive towards more authoritarian relationships or social and political arrangements. And as a friend of mine who's a researcher in Europe likes to say, it's as if you had a bartender who, is making a drink with 3 ingredients, right? There's theocracy, there's corporate dominance or oligarchic dominance, right? And there's racial and ethnic nationalism. And the ratios are a little different, country to country, region to region, but it's really the same toxic admixture at the end of the day. And it's not a question of whether it'll be authoritarian, it's a question of which tendencies will predominate. And to a certain extent, I think that's what's going on. And I yield back the non-existing remainder of my time.
Thank you. This is very important. Sangeeta, on this question.
Yes. One is like, and again, following what Walter and Tarso have said, one is like, I don't think, fascism is not something that one can sort of build overnight, or just having a fascist leader is going to result in a fascist regime, right? A fascist state or society. It's about the society being fascistic, not, and then the leader sort of being propped up or, brought into sort of power by a fascistic society. So there's a certain level of, and again, I think it's so important to sort of bring in the cultural elements of neoliberalism, that neoliberalism is not simply an economic doctrine, right? And the way in which it sort of actually then permeates and percolates into sort of, mass consciousness is, I think, a very important sort of, again, setting the stage for a rise of a certain kind of fascistic society. And, one that is sort of really sort of, this whole thing around disciplining the self and, being sort of entrepreneurial or all of those kinds of things. So I think neoliberalism is a big part of the story, but I think we miss out when we don't sort of really look at the cultural dimensions and consequences of neoliberalism and how that has enabled fascist societies to rise. And so, for instance, so why I would sort of, without hesitation sort of say India is in a mode of, proto-fascism, and really beyond authoritarian populism. But I might say that, yes, in the US, it's more authoritarian populism still, because it's, because in India, the RSS, which is sort of the founding, party, sort of the foundational sort of organization of the BJP, BJP is just a political party expression of, what is a cultural formation. RSS as an organization was, founded in 1925 and has kept growing, right? It's got 5 to 6 million members. That is a level of organization that one does not see, for instance, either in Brazil or in the US, right? Which really, I think, completely sort of, there's a qualitative shift then from a certain kind of authoritarian populism to really becoming a fascist society itself, not simply a fascist regime. So just simply voting Modi out of power, the BJP out of power, may not necessarily do away with the ways in which fascism has kind of, become sort of part of the body politic, right? And so I think that's really a key difference between trying to understand sort of the distinction between fascism. And I feel like, yes, that's why the left has a lot of work to do, important work to do with, halting that transition from authoritarian populism to fascism, right? And sort of scaling that back, and not sort of waking up too late to the fact that, yes, now we can call it fascism, and now this is proper fascism, and waking up to the fact sort of too late. Like, there is no point in that. But really understanding that these are elements that we are in the sort of path towards fascism, and that the rollback needs to happen now before institutions and society, in a sense, becomes fascistic.
And that is a very good segue into the final question, and then we'll take comments and questions from the viewers. And we have about 30 minutes left. So what do we do? That's the question. We on the left, speaking as leftists, in light of this global specter that has its specificities in each country, what do we do? So I'm going to start with you, Sangeeta. What do we do? You're on mute again.
Certainly when I sort of look at, the left and like us, the big failure is in the failure of sort of not organizing, right? And not being, not organizing in, in the ways where, that the left was organizing, for instance, in the, the 20s and the 30s and the 40s, and, up to the maybe 60s. And so definitely, some of my early work has been on looking at the NGOization of sort of this kind of grassroots organizing, right? And that definitely, I think, has thwarted sort of, the way in which one can, because it is very much a sort of also the cultural phenomena, right? Fascism. And so it means sort of really working with and organizing at the grassroots, which I think left parties generally have sort of really, in some way, that's where I think we've really failed to be at sort of, the forefront of mass organizing and mass membership, building mass membership and mass base. So there was another point that I wanted to make, but I'm just sort of forgetting what it is, but I'll hand my place over.
Okay. All right, we'll come back to you then. Walter, what do we do?
Yes, I'm aware that this discussion takes place in the different regions under completely different conditions. One of the conditions in Europe is, of course, the fact that we still have left radical mass parties, some of them being more successful, some of them being less successful, some of them in government, some of them in opposition. And that makes, of course, a difference. And in the discussions which we have in Europe on the far right, there are two extreme positions. The one position is the one of, so to say, the young radicals who say we have to confront the fascists militantly, and whenever they show up, we have to beat them up. We have to prevent them from making their rallies and manifestations. One variant. The other variant is the ones who say, well, fascism, right-wing nationalism is such a horrible thing. We have to unite all the forces who are against it, from liberals to Greens to humanists of all sorts. And the latter ends usually up by saying, and that's why we have to vote the Social Democrats. Because they are the last resort which we have. I would say that the question in Europe is to find the right combination between two aspects. The one aspect is, and here I fully agree with the idea that we have to put center stage the question of culture, because in all our societies, on the one side, there is a process of dehumanization underway, and it's triggered by neoliberalism and its brutal and social Darwinistic foundations, if you want to say so. But at the same time, you have huge resources of humanist movements. We have had in 2015 a marvelous movement in most of the countries concerned in solidarities with the refugees. We have also a broad mass movement in our societies which solidarizes itself with Black Lives Matters. We have large parts of the Christian communities and churches who are solidaristic with the refugees and who are opposed to far-right nationalism and chauvinism. And I think the left must be able to unite with all these humanistic forces in the society. But I also believe that the left must renew its class base. And that's not an ideological issue to refer to a working class, which most likely have not even existed in the 50s or in the 60s. The working class of today is multinational, multi-ethnic. It's women, it's the care sector, it's public sector, it's unemployed, it's precariously living people. And that requires a new notion of class consciousness and class solidarity. I believe that only in this combination of being a class-orientated movement and to be a movement who upholds contact with all layers of society, which are democratic and humanistic, can build the wall against the rise of fascism. And the problem in Europe now is, since the situation in the different countries differs very much, to find the right combination between these two aspects. And there is not one size fits all strategy, because in Spain, there is the left in the government and copes with the pandemic. And you have, for example, the municipality of Madrid saying the pandemic, that is an issue of the working class neighborhoods, that's why we have to blockade them. That's the situation in Madrid, where it's obvious that the pandemic has this class aspect. Then you have situations like in Germany or in Austria, where you have people saying, why I'm 35, I'm 25, why should I bother for these guys over 60? Of course, they are risking to die, but after 65, you have to be prepared to die. And this anti-humanistic trend in society demands a response from the left which differs. And I would say that we very carefully must find the right combination in order to be capable in any moment to have a counter movement, but at the same time, of course, to be able to present a political alternative. We run for elections. We propose governments, which may be alliance governments between us, the Greens, and the Social Democrats. And what is now our distinguishing characteristic in such a government? And that has to do with class, obviously, but with class of the 21st century and not of a nostalgic notion of a class as it might have been in the 19th or at the beginning of the 20s.
Thank you. Tarso.
Well, obviously anything we offer here will be vastly incomplete in terms of the things that the left needs to consider. I would offer you a few additional thoughts. One, in much of the world, we need to prepare ourselves for fighting and building movements under in conditions of increasing state and vigilante violence. And so just there are different strategies, techniques, community safety, mutual support, variety of things that are not held within the living memory of many of our social movements, particularly in the global north, that we'll have to draw upon. I think a second thing is in a moment where we have the rise of a kind of a new axis of authoritarian states and leaders who compete and cooperate. I wouldn't call it an international, but you can be an anti-Semite and you can also be the prime minister of Israel and be in this club, right? You can be, you could have Trump and Erdogan and so forth. These folks understand where the winds are blowing, and the game of statecraft is to be in this new global arrangement that is still developing. It seems to me that any left that is responsive to this moment has to position itself as an anti-authoritarian internationalist left. And I don't just mean right-wing authoritarianism, I mean authoritarianism. If it's authoritarianism and it calls itself left, in my view, it's not left, but there's a lot of debate and dispute as yet on the left about that. I do think we have to have a very clear anti-authoritarian posture. I think in many places, and maybe this has come up in this conversation so far under the context of culture, I think there's a fundamental fight the left has been losing, in some cases because it hasn't waged it at all or very well, around who's the we. Like who are agents of history, who are members of our society, to whom is government responsive? The right has been extremely effective at defining the we in narrower and narrower, more exclusionary and more violently expulsionary ways that in a way is parallel to the kind of tendencies within neoliberal capitalism. If we read Saskia Sassen around this notion of expulsion. Actually, we're not trying to incorporate everything. We're willing to just get rid of some of it. We're willing to just eliminate some of it, whether it's in the economic modality or whether it's in the social and cultural modality. I think this fight for the we is critical. It relates to themes that Sangeeta and Walter are raising about who do we mean when we talk about the working class or working classes, right? And how do we actually form mass organizations, whether defined as worker organizations or in some other way, that actually reflect that notion of the we? that people could imagine themselves belonging to and thriving within and wanting to be part of. I think without winning that fight as to who we are, right, what we represent, who gets to be represented in society, who has a claim on society, we lose everything else, right? There's no political or social or any other kind of traction. So I do think that while, for instance, in this particular moment in the United States is incredibly politically fraught, the balance of powers are very much arrayed against us, it's actually culturally a very interesting and generative and complicated moment in terms of that contestation finally over who's the we, from which I take some heart and some hope. And I do think we need to lean into a notion of a multiracial, ethnic, if it's the vernacular that works, feminist governance and economies. And if we don't understand that part of how authoritarianism builds itself is on the pillar of misogyny, and if we're not clear about an answer to that, that is feminist in its deliberately feminist in its expression, in its leadership, in its imaginings of community and care, I think we lose, right? And so I think this question of that tends to get reduced in left discussions about identity politics and so forth, a bunch of nonsense, is really a question about who's the we and what are our core values. And part of being anti-authoritarian is in fact having a gendered answer to that, as well as an economic answer to that, as well as an answer to that with respect to race and to ethnicity. And then I think finally, the left in many parts of the world has got to get over its aversion to engaging with faith and religion. And this came up already in passing. And I will just say to my comrades here in the United States, as an example, not as the paradigm globally, is that anybody who thinks that you build power in a place like this without engaging this question of race or without engaging questions of religion and faith, it's just not a serious power analysis. And so when I say that the left is often much or more a prisoner of nostalgia, right, than these right-wing movements, I'm very serious about that. We have to learn from our mistakes and engage the material and cultural realities that we're actually embedded in if we actually have any hope of building real, authentic, multiracial democracy worth its name. So I think we need to block the further consolidation of authoritarian power, and we need to build alternatives and figure out how we do those things at the same time.
Great.
If I could just quickly add a couple of points to just, that sort of piggyback on what Tarso has said. One of the things I wanted to add, that really resonates with what he said was, the whole sort of remaking of history or building a new narrative that the left needs to do, and that we have really not been able to. And, and these are very much the same discussions and debates that we are having within sort of, the Indian diasporic left also around sort of, again, how do you engage with, because it's a Hindu nationalist movement, how do you engage with sort of, the religion of Hinduism that, but in a way that is going to be feminist, anti-casteist, rather than just say, okay, we are completely, we are leftist and we don't engage with religion and we're atheists, right? And so we're anti-Hindu. But so we want to be anti-Hindutva, which is sort of the right-wing ideology, and then the remaking of what is a Hindu identity by the right? How does the left sort of take it back and reconstruct that in a different way to build these new sort of alliances? And the other thing that we have seen, for instance, with the the BJP and the Hindu nationalist regime has been the way in which they've been going after intellectuals, scholars, and activists who write in the regional language, which means that they're the ones who speak, not writing and speaking in English, but really in the regional languages in India. They've been assassinated, right? They've just been eliminated because they're the ones who are really can be speaking to the proletariat classes, the rural and the mass base of the rural and the agricultural sort of and the peasantry in the countryside. They've realized that and so yes, some of the English speaking and writing intellectuals and activists have been put into jail or have been sort of threatened, etc. But the way in which they've really gone after eliminating the scholars and the intellectuals and who do their work in the regional language, I think that is a very telling and also then the attack on universities has been phenomenal. So I think that's another area for the left actually to be, doing some serious work in terms of political education and critical adult education that is not confined to universities or the formal education spaces, which again, I think we have sort of reneged on.
Okay, we have 14 minutes. And so, Cliff, do we have some questions? I see one in the chat from Meju. Should I just read that, or do you want to go with, do you have other questions? Cliff, can't hear you. Can't hear you, you're muted. You're still muted, Cliff.
Okay,
right.
I couldn't unmute while screen sharing. Sorry about that.
Okay.
Yes, we have some questions that have come in. Let me just share one with you that has come into the email, and from Gregory Diamant. And I will.
Why don't we read several of them, Cliff, given the amount of time, and then the panelists can pick whichever one they want to respond to.
All right. Some of them are a little lengthy, but and I would like to screen share them so that you can see them as I read them. Let's see, here we have. Okay. This one from Gregory Diamant. Orban has self-described his regime in Hungary as illiberal democracy, or one could also positive as authoritarian democracy. Secondly, the rise of the right can be attributed to the failure of the left to a great extent. One thing we have to be careful about in fighting against right-wing authoritarianism is that we don't lose sight that the major goal has to be to transcend capitalism. And as you think about that, let me call up a second question. And this one from I don't know who this is, Glyn. So don't all populist movements have at their base an economic concern of the predominantly upper working, lower middle class, and an anxiety that brings them together to contest the current economic political elite? A process which in Europe, at least, is being driven by globalization, which has meant downward pressure on their people's incomes. Consequently, they close ranks against the others or outsiders who they see as the groups who threaten their economic status. Further, as capitalist neoliberalism inevitably, by virtue of its international economic systems, drives down wages in the previously prosperous Europe, try to deflect blame upon the working classes of other countries, trying to divide and rule the potential international socialist movement. In other parts of the world, it may be the very poor, particularly incel males, who seek redemption through religions which have been captured by political activists who may utilize them in anti-colonial and anti-neo-colonial movements. Okay, maybe that's enough to digest.
And then we have one more, which is
get some comments
from Meju. I'm just going to read hers, and then the speakers, can address whichever one you want, but you got to do it very concisely because we have 10 minutes. So the final question: there have been several periods of authoritarianism, as Tarso described. There have also been periods of socialist victory and experimentation. One of those was the pink tide in Latin America, destroyed by economic and political meddling by the US. This opened the door for right-wing victories. While every rise in the right has a national character, how do we act as internationalists? I'm particularly interested in Mexico, which has a new but fragile progressive government in power. So I'm going to start, Sangeeta, with you. And we've got 10 minutes, less than 10 minutes for the three of you.
Okay, I'm not sure I'm going to get to, all of the questions. I'm going to pick a certain, couple of points that were raised in the email questions.
You got 3 minutes.
Transcending capitalism, most certainly. And I think, COVID-19 and what has happened sort of globally, I don't think we have had a moment like this where sort of, the limits or the failures, of our capitalism are so, stand so exposed for the world to see and actually palpably live and, experience sort of really the failures of capitalism. And so, this is really a critical moment to start sort of formulating, why, that we have no recourse but to have, to build an alternative to capitalism, right? Including sort of, if you think about climate crisis that is happening at the same time as the pandemic and, the sort of unemployment crisis and the health crisis. That's one thing. The other part, there was a question around sort of really looking at sort of, that it's how, the othering, starts because there is a certain way in which there's the working class in a country is suddenly suffering and, their wages are not going up or their, standard of living has been affected. And so they start sort of blaming this, the others. And I think that that's really a very limited explanation, because in India, again, if you see that, the Muslim minority has been made the enemy in the other. And the Muslims in India are actually are at the sort of the poorest of the poor. They represented the poorest of the poor. And who's the one who's doing the othering is the affluent classes who are actually making their fortunes on Silicon Valley and in the new tech economy, right? And in the new outsourcing economy. They're the ones who are actually, thriving, but they're the ones who are then also, doing sort of, participating in the sort of anti-Muslim kind of, the sort of bashing of, of Muslims, and literally and metaphorically. And so and there's an absolute contempt for the poor. So this is not, I wouldn't sort of say, yes, it's, the working class is hurting. And so then they start sort of doing this othering. I think that that's too simplistic and narrow an explanation and slides back into this kind of, I think, more lazy left theorizing.
Thank you very much. Walter.
First, let me say this just to avoid any misunderstanding. I truly and deeply believe that the left must be anti-authoritarian and it must be feminist, otherwise it's not a left. Secondly, when it comes to authority, I think that the socialist left must look more deeply into the world of labor. Because actually, where authoritarianism in the society is rooted, apart from cultural behavior, is the capitalist production process. And neoliberalism is genuinely anti-democratic because it's based on private property. And the richer the 1% becomes, the less democratic society is. And we must talk on property and ownership as organic component of a moral and cultural revolution, to say it in the terms of Gramsci. And the last, maybe provocative idea is, of course, we have to learn of our failures. But I think the deepest reason for the cultural defeat of the left lies in the fact that it has unlearned to learn from its victories. Meaning, when discussing about culture and analysis of society, we do not start from point zero. And if we are not able to create a continuity of emancipatory struggles from the 19th century to the 21st one, then we do not deliver to the next generation what actually our duty is. So, of course, the rise of the far right has to do with the failure of the left. But that does not say anything, because if the left loses, the right wins. And if the left wins, the right loses. We must ask ourselves what creates, under historic circumstances, the real condition and relation of power. And I think we should be more cautious and more careful in looking into it. And last sentences, I forgot this at the very beginning. I'm very grateful that you have invited me for this very interesting and fascinating panel across the continent, which show that today's capitalism is not only characterized by individualization, but also by global socialization of our capacities, and let's make the best out of it.
Thank you very much. Tarso, you have the last word.
Well, just a few things. I think that to avert the further consolidation of power by far-right forces in many different regional and national contexts will require the exercise of power beyond what the left has at its disposal. And so there are some conundrums there. I don't think that in many cases we will forestall the consolidation of authoritarian power, for instance, without actors that are not aligned with our vision of a transformative society, whom we need to be in relationship with and we need to act. So there is a block, there's a block operation here that needs to be larger than the left. And there's a build operation that, of course, will be grounded in the left and needs to build beyond the capacities we currently have. And that won't always, the block activity can't always be anti-capitalist in character for obvious reasons. We need class defections, we need, parts of the elite, various kinds of elites to act to forestall the worst things from happening, even if it's done from a kind of desire for a status quo ante that none of us have any interest in returning to. So I think that's part of this. I think that our movements need to be, as motivated by freedom as by power, and holding those things together and thinking about what are the vehicles for not only state and governing capacity, but for liberation, and where does that lead us into activity against the state? Where does it lead us into activity within the state? And where does that lead us into activity outside the state? And often debates on the left are about whether we do one or the other of these things versus what's the array of our energies across these different kinds of capacities. And of course, as we lose access to the state in many cases, we have to adjust accordingly across those pieces. And I guess the final thing I would say is, I think we're in a generational scale struggle, at least here. And so the other thing we need is a sense of time and of scale for what's going to be involved. If history is any indicator in terms of waves, authoritarian waves, this is not going to conform to election cycles, even if those are inflection points in various nation states. And so I think, thinking about a 20, 30-year cycle here for the left is also a really important thing for us, so that we don't just think about what we're doing next year, next 6 months, next 5 years, but to really have the spaciousness to think about cycles of work that will happen over multiple periods of overlapping periods of time. It's hard to have the discipline to think that way when we're on our heels. But in fact, if we're right that this is the kind of period we're leaning into, then we have to develop the space and capacities for thinking along a somewhat longer arc of time. And thank you too for inviting me for this really interesting conversation. I hope that it was provocative in a useful way, right? Not needless provocations, but thought-inducing provocations that support all of us to do more effective work.
Well, you were each brilliant. And I want to thank you for taking the time to do this. This is exactly the kind of discussion that we on the left side of the aisle need to be engaged in globally. I'm hoping that, given that this discussion has been recorded, that people will access it elsewhere, and that there'll be feedback. So I want to thank you all very, very much, and I want to thank Cliff and your center for having sponsored this, and I want to thank you, the listeners and viewers, for having joined us today in this discussion. Thank you all very much, and stay safe, stay strong, and let's defeat the fascists. Take care.
And on behalf of the Center for Global Justice, I want to express a very strong thank you to Bill Fletcher for assembling this excellent panel and navigating us through a rich discussion. It has been recorded and will be available on our website, globaljusticecenter.org. We also have there the previous webinars, that all of which have been recorded, and information about upcoming webinars. The one next week will be on NAFTA 2.0, the revised NAFTA, and we have both a Mexican academic and a U.S. Economist who will be talking about NAFTA, what's new in this new version of NAFTA. I want to give thanks also to the Liz Mestras, Gregory Diamant, Roberto Robles, Coletta Mora, Olivia Canales, and Betsy Bowman, our team that has worked on organizing these webinars. The following week, by the way, a special program for Columbus Day, as it used to be called. We will have a panel on First Peoples Day, where we will look at what can be learned from the first peoples from whom these lands were stolen centuries ago. We have many other excellent webinars coming up that you won't want to miss. There is also this one on, that's this one. Sorry. We have here, U.S. foreign policy and the 2020 elections, anti-imperialist struggles in the years ahead. A talk by political scientist Harry Targ. So there's lots more coming. We've got programming already in the can up to early January. And as I say, we're happy to receive your suggestions for future webinars that you would like to hear. So hope to see you next week as we look at NAFTA 2.0. And thanks again to Bill and fellow panelists.
Thank you. Thank you to the Global Justice Center. This is really valuable to my panelists.
Yes.
Yep, thanks to all.
Yeah, it was a rich discussion. I want to congratulate you all for your very